Reading the work The Godfather by Mario Puzo, and in this work, of course, he goes through in a fictional context how secret organizations or secret crime organizations operate, such as what you can call the mafia. Of course, the mafia, especially let's say the mafia of Italian origin, is quite romanticized in our popular culture. But it's interesting to note the very realistic way in which Mario Puzo writes about such secret crime organizations. And he suggests these ideas of insulation, or how these organizations work behind the scenes and they have layers of insulation to prevent any sort of public outrage about certain crimes or certain events being connected to them, and they try their best to sort of stay away from the public eye as much as possible, at least like the top brass of these mafia organizations do. And it's interesting to note, of course, the very realistic way in which this is portrayed. Because a lot of people at times are very naive about these sorts of secret organizations, let's say, and how they operate. In reality, a lot of information tends to be available about these organizations in the real world, but it tends to be closed off behind layers of insulation, or it tends to be in the public eye, but it's sort of cast off to the side, or it's protected, like I said, by layers of insulation. So even though you can access that information, it's not so obvious where you can get that information from, and oftentimes making connections between different organizations can become difficult. It's also important to note the element of discussion of power, of how power plays out in the real world. And the great flaw perhaps in the minimalist argument, perhaps, or the argument that the government should not intervene in certain affairs of the public sphere, or that the government should play a minimal role, is that where you abdicate power, where you create a power vacuum intentionally, another power will rise to fill that vacuum. And so, if the government or if the state, let's say, isn't influencing one area of the society, then inevitably another power, another organization, another institution will rise up to assert its dominance in that place. And this can be seen in the example of the underworld, especially in the context of this story, where the mafia organizations, let's say, they control various industries. And obviously in the context of the United States where this is taking place, because the government, let's say, doesn't interfere in certain private industries, it gives full reign to these mafia organizations to take control of them. And so, of course, whilst I do support a more libertarian government, let's say, and I don't necessarily support an authoritarian government, I can still appreciate the fact that this is perhaps a flaw within the libertarian model, because inevitably power is as power does, right? And the people who have the ability to enforce their will on the society will inevitably do so, either for money or fame or resources or whatnot. And it's a very natural human thing to do. And it's very naive to think that if the state abdicates power in a certain arena, that another power will not rise up. Now, I think it's important to note that it is oftentimes better for the state to not intervene in certain areas of the public sphere or in certain private industries, because more organic institutions, let's say, or more organic forms of organization can take their place. But sometimes what does happen is that criminals or people with bad intentions can oftentimes dominate these sorts of industries. Of course, in the case of, The Godfather, the organizations that are represented are given a bit more of a nuanced sort of description, or they are given a more nuanced image in that they are very human in the way they behave, they are very rational, and even the things that they do which perhaps are morally wrong, or the certain crimes they commit, it's not necessarily anything personal, it's just business as usual, as they say in the story. And so it's an interesting thing to note there. And also, it's very much within the context of immigration, of Italian immigrants, of course. Before sort of, the, let's say, the immigration of non-white or non-European groups was sort of focused upon, an issue that used to exist earlier on in, let's say, American history was other European groups who were immigrating to America, because the American establishment at one point predominantly was the sort of Anglo-Saxon establishment, the people of British descent. And so people like the Italians, like the Jews, were often looked upon as outsiders, and they were often, treated with a bit of disdain, let's say, or distaste. And so the Italians obviously had to work their way up through businesses. And so Mario Puzo gives a really realistic description of how these businesses would have arose, and at times how they would have dealt with certain industries which may be associated with the underground or the underworld or the black market. And of course, these mafia organizations tend to dabble in institutions at times which aren't very moral, let's say, such as gambling or the drug trade or arms deals, for example, or clubs, let's say. But regardless, it's important to know at times that immigrants or people from an immigrant background, especially the first generations, tend to hustle very hard in terms of their businesses. And of course, that's very much in the hope of giving their children a better life. And it's also represented in the story, in the context of the story, that these organizations are very rationalistic in their dealings. They're not these kinds of pure evil, maniacal bosses who are just trying to dominate different industries and just trying to kill everybody who disagrees with them. No, they are seeking out profits. They are seeking out the best outcome for them and their families, for their organizations. And they do care about the people that they are associated with. And even if they do engage in perhaps certain immoral actions, it's simply just part of the business, part of the world in which they're in, and it's nothing personal per se. And so I think what I really like about The Godfather by Mario Puzo is that he gives a really realistic sort of description of the underworld, of these mafia organizations, and he actively and he very accurately portrays this kind of real politique that goes on between these mafia organizations. And it also shows that when, let's say, there's a power vacuum in a certain industry or a certain area of society, organic institutions tend to form to fill up that power vacuum.